Locals and overseas guests, thank you all very much for joining us today. Please know that the session is being recorded, and please share that because we have had many questions about such. The upcoming lecture is the third in our Bermuda and the Atlantic World series. In March, we featured the topic, the early Atlantic age, looking at the dates from 1250 to 1609, with the critical question, why and how did we get here? In July, we followed with building a maritime community and maritime state, early settlement and economic growth from 1609 to 1800, addressing the question, what are the critical relationships and adaptations that shaped Bermuda? Both lectures by Dr. Clarence Maxwell can be found on our website under nmb.bm/lecture. Each lecture, such as today's, is followed by a professional development workshop for our local educators, building on the content of the lecture and delivering on valuable critical thinking resources for the classroom. In this way, the National Museum stays true to the goal of expanding our ongoing understanding of the complexities of the Atlantic world and the forces that have shaped today's realities. As a core curriculum component, history helps place knowledge and lived experience into context. History nurtures empathy, promotes understanding of divergent perspectives, and builds comparative and critical thinking skills. Indeed, without history, it's difficult to explain how Bermuda positions itself to the world, how this has been done in the past, in the present, and how this will be done in the future. The Atlantic World Lecture Series highlights contemporary new academic research, and thanks to our guest lecturers, the National Museum of Bermuda continues to build bridges between what happens in conservation labs and archives and research spaces with what happens in exhibit halls, classrooms, and on computer screens like today. So thank you again for joining us. In today's lecture, Dr. Kristy Warren will speak to the topic, Pushing the Boundaries of Freedom, 1790 to 1860, while exploring the question, how did free people of color and enslaved individuals in Bermuda navigate local and international power structures in their fight for freedom? And we're going to take a pause and put to all of you the first question that we'd like for you to respond to, please, in the chat. And a simple question, in one word, what is freedom to you? Yeah, I like equity right off the bat, Nathan, for sure. I was speaking that on the radio the other day, you know, without, we always talk about equality, but before we can get to equality, we have to have equity first. Definitely, Arlene, the question of agency is really very much rooted in the topic today. And agency is very much our theme for the professional development workshop on Saturday with teachers. And agency, for those thinking, what is agency other than travel agency? I mean agency as in power. All of these words we're looking at here, justice, independence, having a voice, excellent. Our director, Elena Strong, chiming in with rights, choice, access, and which actually is positions well even for today, you know, to be underwritten and supported financially to be able to offer this lecture series to the public and to have it recorded and available online is very much all about this issue of access. Living untamed, that's a fascinating thought, actually, Nicole. You know, and just as we have the context around us, not just, of course, the health conditions, which are extremely restrictive and completely altering the idea of freedom in our world, it's just also thinking about the larger political structures that are affecting countries today on top of what the challenge already is with health. And I keep thinking about Hong Kong. It's on my mind. Autonomy, yeah, Leslie, it's another really important one. So we do the polls in our lectures in order to engage as much as we can in this fairly strange medium where you can see me, hear me, I can't see you, but it is our real goal that as much as we can, that we construct a dialogue of sorts. And so with that, I'd like to move on, and feel free to keep typing in your answers, please, to what is freedom, and hold that thought really, and hold what you know and own on freedom throughout this talk today. We'll move to our second question. And if I've made a mistake in that and we're coming back to that later, that's fine. I will introduce Dr. Kristy Warren. She reminds me that she says, I'm not an historical professor. And I say, well, I don't know about that. I think her approach is fascinating. She researches the socio-political history of British colonialism in Bermuda and the wider Caribbean. And she's interested in how colonialism continues to inform current and institutional processes. She's interested also further in how we as a Caribbean people or Atlantic people have played and continue to play a role in systemic change. So with that, I'd like to please welcome, and I'm sure if we were together, we would be applauding, Dr. Warren.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to join us this evening. I'm really pleased to be here and to be talking about Bermuda's history with you. When I was speaking with Lisa, I explained that I'm not strictly a historian. I do have history degrees, but my last degree is actually in sociology. So a lot of the work that I do integrates those two disciplines, as well as trying to think about what Christina Sharp calls being undisciplined. So thinking beyond the structures that the disciplines, which only have really existed since the 19th century, have placed on us and how they limit our thinking. Michel Rothschild, another amazing thinker, said, how can one discipline help us capture the story of a people that the 19th century forgot? He was speaking specifically of people of the African diaspora. That's who I'm centering in my talk today. But before I get into it, I want to explain a little bit how I came to do this work. Between 2004 and 2007, I had a job writing summaries of thousands of letters that were sent from the governor of Bermuda to the colonial office in London between 1780 and 1926 for the catalog at the National Archives in London. Spending years looking at late 18th, 19th, and 20th century colonial documents showed me the importance of giving evidence of how people resisted and fought back against ideas and laws, which gave freedom to some by denying it to others. Looking over these documents showed me the power of individuals and groups to both make laws that serve their interests, as well as the challenges made to such laws when they are shown to be inequitable. Doing this work also revealed how these inequalities, though driven by people, become embedded in institutions and therefore live longer than those who initiate them. I feel that part of undoing the inequalities of this past has left us with involves going back to those same documents to read both with and against the line to show how blatant the discrimination was and what those faced with an unfair system were and were not able to do about it. What the documents can give us is limited. We must always keep in mind who made them and the purpose for which they were made. In this case, they were made by colonial administrators to aid the smooth running of a colony and by extension, an empire. Local affairs, therefore, were always framed within the needs of Britain's empire. Decisions by a Bermudian government was thus either aided or ignored by the British government, depending on how it fit into this wider picture. For although self-ruling, acts were approved in London. So this is the second question, and it frames a lot of what we'll be thinking about tonight. It'd be great if you could think through this question. You don't have to use just one word this time. What power individually and collectively do we have to affect change? Much. Her voice.
And Kristy, we can also come back to these as we will see them in the chat
Right.
once we get further in or to your conclusion, if you'd like.
Okay, that sounds good. When we read about history in textbooks, popular texts, and some academic work, we often get a neatly packaged narrative that the historian has crafted. Tonight is really no different in many ways. I've chosen the records to look at. I've chosen the order in which to look at them. Less often do we get to think about the ways history is written. We miss the messiness of the historical process, the decisions made by the historian about what to include, what to leave out, what sources are deemed trustworthy, which are not, the questions that arise, and those that remain unanswered, even when the narrative has become a package. I'll be drawing on key texts for this period of Bermuda's history, including, but not limited to, Nellie Musson's Mind the Onion Seed, Cyril Packwood's Chained on the Rock, and Dr. Kenneth E. Robinson's Heritage. I think it's significant to note that two of these texts are out of print, with Musson and Robinson's books not being printed since the 1970s. There is a wealth of information in these books that help offer context, further context, and alternative views to other texts about Bermuda's past, which have not centered the experience of Black Bermudians. Some of the stories and narratives of the late 18th and 19th centuries have been revisited more recently by Bermudians. I was going to try and name people, but the list started becoming so long, I didn't want to kind of exclude anyone by saying only 2 or 3 names. But I'm happy to talk about some of the work I've drawn on. Not everyone gets mentioned in the talk, but some do, as well as researchers in the US and Canada. There are, of course, also texts that won't be referenced here, but that's the nature of any talk. I need to say a special thank you to Carla Ingeman at the National Archives, at the Bermuda Archives, sorry, who, as I faced lockdown in the UK and was unable to conduct further research, helped me bring this together. This lecture covers the time period 1790 to roughly 1860. I think the last reference I actually have is for 1855. For expediency, it's divided into pre and post-abolition, that is in the summer of 1834. The majority of my time will be spent on the pre-emancipation period. However, a number of key themes underpin what is discussed, even though not all of them will be directly addressed. These include the importance of community and family to Africans in Bermuda, the different ideas of freedom that existed, the importance of both the large revolutions and revolts and uprisings of the enslaved people across the Caribbean, how colonial governance is linked to the ways in which people were moved within and outside of Bermuda, the desire to control the growth of the Black population, and the way in which this is underpinned by ideas of race that were in the process of being made and remade. We also have a number of people, if you can pick them up in my word map, I think some of them got disjointed. We have enslaved Africans, free people of color, as they were called at the time, the formerly enslaved, white elites, white workers, British administrators, convicts, migrants, missionaries, military and Navy personnel. Our primary focus will be on the engagement of enslaved and free people of color with the state, both local and imperial, as well as those who claimed ownership of enslaved people. So this is the first section, 1790 to 1834. After the American War of Independence, Bermuda was seen as a critical trading post that linked the northernmost British colonies with the Caribbean. Garrisons were introduced and British officials not trusting white Bermudians to stay loyal to the crown. The renewed interest also meant that the island changed from being an occasional naval base to a mid-Atlantic fortress, defending the only link between Britain's colonies in the Caribbean and North America. This change in status underpinned the decision made by the Bermuda legislature in 1795 to allow the British Crown to purchase land in the westernmost part of the island to build an imperial dockyard. The potential disloyalty to the crown of local white inhabitants continued to be a concern held by colonial officials. Locally, the fear of internal insurrection of enslaved people also persisted. This fear was fed in part by Bermuda's own recent past, as well as revolts in the Caribbean. In 1791 in Saint-Domingue, now Haiti, enslaved Africans rose up demanding their freedom. They drew not only on French ideas of freedom, but also on African cosmologies in the pursuit of liberty. Information about the Saint-Domingue liberation attempts were brought to Bermuda by French refugees. Britain and France then went to war, during which time Napoleon abolished slavery in France's Caribbean colonies, including Saint-Domingue. This meant that for the remainder of the 1790s, the French and British were ideologically opposed with regards to slavery. Another shift occurred at the end of the decade in Bermuda with the arrival of Methodist preacher John Stevenson, who was on a mission to save the souls of the island's Black people. Stevenson unnerved local elites due to known Methodist proclivities towards abolition. His holding meetings in the homes of Black people is what got him pulled up before magistrate in 1800. The magistrate noted that Stevenson could incite an uprising among the enslaved, explaining that this preaching to the Blacks may be very dangerous. You know what has taken place in the island of Saint-Domingue. Here we have a direct link between what's happening in Haiti and fears about what could also happen in Bermuda. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I have a few of these slides scattered throughout the presentation. How much I'll go into them will depend on how much time I have, but I'll start with this one of runaway ads. The Mercury newspaper of Barbados, which ran from 1783 to 1839, has been digitized through the British Library's Endangered Archives program. An interesting project to emerge from this is a collaboration between the Barbados Archives and the Early Caribbean Digital Archive, and is entitled the Barbados Runaway Slave Digital Collection Project. Those working on the project see the ads as a way to reclaim stories about enslaved people in a community-engaged way. As the Royal Gazette here is already digitized, it is possible to do similar work to build on references made to runaway ads found in existing texts, including some of those that I showed you earlier. These ads provide evidence both of how individuals who were enslaved were dehumanized, and also of how they resisted a system that sought to define them as less than human. So the first snapshot comes from 1790 to 1795. So far, I've found 16 people who ran away during this time, only using one keyword search. The first ad is for Sarah, which you can see in the upper right corner, which we find on the front page of the Royal Gazette on the 31st of July, 1790. We learn that although apparently enslaved in Port Royal, her mother is in St. David's. Her appearance is also described as being yellow complexion. These descriptions can be quite problematic, as can also be seen by the description given of Colonel, which I've highlighted on this slide. But by reading between the words that are written here, I feel we can see a man who knew his own worth. He's described as haughty, for instance, and impudent visage, having an impudent visage. We also learn as well where Colonel has connections, having been supposedly harbored in the north side of Brackish Pond and Harris Bay. We also learn, well, I learned by looking through a number of papers, that he was able to stay on the run for at least 3 years, as 6 ads were placed about him between 1791 and 1793. I don't know from what I've been able to see if they gave up or if he was recaptured, but it's enlightening to be able to see these types of ads. So here I'm going to talk about 2 people, just briefly, Mary Prince and Jemmy Darrell. This is not an image of Jemmy Darrell, but a general image from the museum's collection of a pilot. We don't, as far as I know, have a picture of Jemmy Darrell. We don't have one of Mary Prince either, although some really beautiful work has been done recently. I really appreciate, for instance, the work of Vanessa Turner in bringing her spirit to the canvas. Mary Prince's life gives an idea of, as Royal Saltus notes, the wider social, economic, and political cartography of this island in the decades before the abolition of slavery. Saltus goes on to explain that Prince's parents' work was rooted in the island's seafaring industry, but by the 1780s, the maritime pursuits that had buttressed the island were becoming increasingly less viable due to the shifting international borders and policies established in the aftermath of the American War of Independence. Prince grew up and worked in an island experiencing deepening economic crisis. Her experiences in Bermuda offer a counter-narrative to those provided by British administrators, observers like Suzette Lloyd, and even some modern historians who frame Bermudian slavery as benevolent, often by using comparisons to situations elsewhere. But as Saltus shows us, the situation needs to be considered within the context of the specific society. The form that slavery took in Bermuda fit the needs of the colony. It was not because white Bermudian enslavers were particularly benevolent. The experiences that Mary Prince had moving from childhood into adulthood show that there were a range of ways that enslavers engaged with the enslaved, but the situation of slavery remained that of withholding the freedom of another human being for personal gain. Speaking of freedom, the freedom of Jemmy Darrell also gives us insight into Bermudian society, showing how someone might be liberated, in Darrell's case for being an exceptional pilot, and what being free for the formerly enslaved actually meant. Darrell was manumitted in 1796. He was not a young man. He very quickly went on to purchase land. As a King's pilot, he worked with other free men and also other enslaved men. But we'll see the relationship in the next session that was built up between these free men. So what's happening around us as the new century starts? France reintroduces slavery to its Caribbean colonies, leading to renewed fighting in Saint-Domingue. In 1804, Haiti's birth creates the first modern republic headed by Black people. Haiti was from the start subjected to sanctions from France and the United States. Additionally, France later demanded compensation for the loss of the colony. This all happened because of what Haiti represented: the possibility of the enslaved ruling themselves and using the resources from what had been one of France's wealthiest colonies to their own ends, rather than in the service of a European empire. This kind of freedom for Black people was feared. The West Indies campaign of the Napoleonic Wars ran from 1804 to 1810 and saw a number of European states in conflict, including Britain. It was out of these wars that Britain came to be the rulers of the waves that they presented themselves as during the 19th century. We also see the end of Britain's involvement in transatlantic slavery, as it was called, with the abolition of slavery, Transatlantic Slavery Act. This, I put on the slide that they outlaw it because as America Sherrod has shown in her work, British people continued to be involved in slavery, working along with other European empires. So although the government called an end to it, a lot of people remained involved. I'm going to skip the next slide because it is another runaway ad and I'm looking at the time, but I'd love to talk more about that some other time. So a lot of, when I was thinking about freedom and agency, what I came to see in this time period was it was a battle about who belongs in Bermuda, who is Bermuda for, and what will Bermuda's future look like. At the turn of the century, Governor George Beckwith commented on the impact of a recent yellow fever outbreak on the population, and also noted that many of the enslaved men were away at sea. Beckwith also stated that the number of free persons of color and free Black people was inconsiderable. This seems to change. The ideas around free people of color seem to change, or at least future governors become more in line with local ideas. I'm not sure which it is yet. For by 1806, the population of Black people surpassed that of the white population. and this fact caused anxiety in those who ruled the island. Although numerated separately, enslaved and free people of color and free Black people were seen as being part of the same issue when it came to the size of the population, grouped in the minds of those who ruled by race, not status. One note about the 1806 census that I picked up from some other documents is that it's thought it's possible the population of Black people was actually higher than reported, as some thought the census was for taxation purposes and withheld the people that they claimed ownership of from being numerated. A law was passed shortly before the abolition of the slave trade in 1807, restricting the manumission of enslaved people, with any such person who was under the age of 40 when manumitted being forced to leave the island. And if they dared to return, they would be enslaved, warned the act. Meanwhile, those who already had their freedom could stay. However, if they had acquired property, they would be prevented from passing it on to their children and others. Those who had not yet purchased property would also be prohibited from doing so. Only a handful of free people of color appeared to have owned land when the law came into effect. No more than 9, it seems. So the threat was not immediate. It is clear, and we make clearer, I hope, in a little while, that the legislator were protecting themselves against what they thought lay in the future. Clarence Maxwell argues that during the Age of Revolution, which began at the end of the 18th century, challenges for citizenship rights came increasingly from free Black people in reaction to restrictive legislation. Whereas before 1764, contestations had materialized in the form of rebellions and uprisings in Bermuda, at this time, such frustrations began to be expressed through petition. The free Black population desired to change laws and customs without demanding the overthrow of the government or the imperial regime, Maxwell explains. This change of focus was not only to do with local laws, but also because the free Black population found allies with liberal whites in the metropole who were participating in the humanitarian revolution, but continued to find resistance among the local white elite. 3 petitions were sent to London concerning the law restricting property ownership. The first was sent to the Navy Commissioners in London in 1806, the second to the Secretary of State of Colonies in 1808, and that's the one, and it should say 21 men. That's the image that you see right now, are the signatures of those men on that second petition, and the last to Vice Admiral Sir John Burleigh's Warren. They emphasized how unfair the law was and that as taxpayers and subjects of the crown, they had rights. In the 1806 petition, James Darrell and Jacob Pitcairn explained that the consequence of the law would be that they would have to sell their property, leave the said island, and become wanderers in some other part of the world where they may find refuge. In the petition of 1808, signed by 21 men, 10 of whom signed their own name, with the rest making their mark, and I think you can see that in the image where you see the X's. It was noted that the act to restrict their owning real estate was so oppressive in its nature, so injurious in its consequences to every moral and religious tie, and so destructive to industry that we are confident this would not have been sanctioned if the enlightened mind of an English governor had presided at the time. When the act had passed, a Bermudian, Henry Tucker, was at the helm. But the idea that English governors were all enlightened was put to the test by the support given by Governor Hodgson to a scheme of the local legislator a couple of years, actually that same year, 1808. The scheme was not known to the petitioners, but it helps to explain what they were fighting against, as we'll see in the next section. Colonial office-based officials expressed shock that the law had received royal consent and suggested that there had been a serious oversight. Governor Hodgson was told to do everything in his power to get the act repealed. And although he said he would do his best, he suggested that the legislator, having already received royal assent, would not be able to be persuaded to repeal it, as they had been very excited when they had gotten the consent. So what is this plan? So Governor Hodgson supported the Bermuda legislators' aim to gradually reduce Bermuda's Black population until all had been sent from the island. The governor presented the scheme to his old friend, Major General Brownrigg, and it was passed on them on condition that they quit the island. Sorry.
Just to say something, this slide got started and things froze. Kristy, do you mind going back a little bit?
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Just to the beginning of this slide, yes?
Yes.
Okay, no problem.
And yeah, when you transition to here, thank you.
Okay. So I mentioned in the last section that something was happening behind the scenes that the petitioners didn't know about. Governor Hudson supported the Bermuda legislators' aims to gradually reduce Bermuda's Black population until all have been sent from the island. The governor presented the scheme to his old friend, Major General Brownrigg, and it was passed on to the Secretary of State for Colonies, who noted that the plan was highly unusual and needed further explanation. The further explanation showed that the first phase of this plan involved raising a regiment of 600 Black men by purchasing up enslaved people, hiring them out for a certain number of years, and then manumitting them on condition of their quitting the island. The scheme was not only directed at men, for as part of this phase one of the plan, women aged 18 to 40 were to be sent to Trinidad as indentured servants, which would pay for their passage there. After a period of time, they would be liberated. Incremental removals of the rest of the enslaved people would follow in subsequent years until all were gone. The Secretary of State also asked how the plan would impact the colony as a whole. That was his greatest concern. Governor Hudson referred to a report by a local committee which argued that the emancipation and removal of the enslaved people from these islands would have the happiest effect upon the industry and prosperity of the colony, because it would allow white men and boys who are not wealthy to take over the jobs held by enslaved people and free people of color. And this reflects back to a law that was passed in 1806 at the same time as the one to restrict ownership of property, which was to give bounties to white men and boys to take up trades, and also to create a tax for free people of color for doing the same work. The desire was to stem the tide of white immigration of those white working class people who were leaving the island, emigrating, mostly men. The committee called the increase in the Black population an evil and explained that we have at present the means of removing it, which may not long be in our power. The aim was then to encourage white Bermudians to stay on the island rather than emigrate. The committee's report also showed that the acts which have been passed in 1806, restricting the rights of free people of color, were hoped to provide a push for them to leave the island. So the very thing the free people of color petitioned against, the idea that it would make them leave home, was the aim of the act. The report also showed the urgency which was felt, that it was felt this needed to be carried out. It seems to allude to the eventual emancipation of the enslaved. Although the scheme never came into being, it shows the vision that those in government had for the future of Bermuda. In this future, there were no Black people. None of the people that signed the petition were women. And so I'm thinking a bit about enslaved women and free people of color. In the wider work that I'm trying to work on, I'm drawing on work by Denise Noble, who talks about the need to feminize and decolonize our studies of this past. Getting at the histories of women, both enslaved and free, is very difficult. But it doesn't mean there aren't things that we can do. And there are a few stories that will come up. But the key ones that we'll look at right now are Mary Prince, continuing on from what we spoke about a bit earlier. She goes to the Turks Islands to rake salt for a number of years, but returns to Bermuda between 1810 and 1815. So is here in the time period that we're talking about right now. We learn more from her about the kinds of work enslaved women had to carry out and the ways in which they were enmeshed in the lives of those who enslaved them. We also learn that Mary wasn't afraid to confront her enslaver when he did things she found morally reprehensible, in one case, beating his own daughter. We also get a glimpse of what might lead someone to run away, and the fact that not all people that run away do it for long periods of time, that sometimes it's only overnight. She explained she didn't know where else to go, but she soon after that gets hired out. So we learn also how she is able to bring in a bit of money for herself. We also have on the slide a small portion of Jemmy Darrow's will, which is from 1815. And here we find the name of his wife. Jemmy Darrow was able to write his will because the law to restrict his ability to pass on his property had expired. And he leaves the land to his wife for the remainder of his life. He also leaves things to his children. But in this case, I just wanted to highlight that he was able to leave his house and that his wife was a part of this. The influence of British colonial directive runs through the Bermudian acts and policies we'll cover in this section. Changes in the way people saw slavery in Britain were impacting what happened here. This was a grassroots shift with everyday people boycotting sugar and pushing for their representatives to end slavery. Some of the early abolitionists based in London, such as Olaudah Equiano, were formerly enslaved people. Changes were also occurring economically, and the protections given to West Indian planters were falling out of favor. The planters fought to retain their position, which was bolstered by their claims of ownership of enslaved people. The slave registers, amelioration acts, and the end of legalized slavery occurred in Bermuda because of what was happening in Britain, which was in turn influenced by what was happening in other colonies. Uprisings occurred in 1823 in Demerara in Jamaica, and then in Jamaica again in 1831, to name just a few. It was the last of these that was especially crucial to the end of slavery. At Christmas time, 20,000 enslaved people in Jamaica went on strike, demanding payment in order to cut sugarcane, which would spoil if it was left too long in the fields. Known as the Baptist War, Sam Sharp's Rebellion, and the Christmas Rebellion, it was one of the largest uprisings and proved that slavery was no longer sustainable in the British Caribbean. So how does that impact us here? The slave registers were used throughout the British Caribbean from the early 19th century. The purpose was to ensure that planters and other enslavers were adhering to the laws passed in 1807, which made the slave trade illegal. This does not mean that the movement of enslaved people between different jurisdictions ended. For the abolition of the slave trade law was not only ended the legal transatlantic trafficking of Africans, for this continued in other guises, as we noted earlier, but also was meant to regulate the movement of people who were already enslaved. This can be seen in returns created in Bermuda. The ones I'm thinking of were made between 1821 and 1824, which show the number of enslaved people who had been exported under license or otherwise. We also see that between 1821 and 1834, the population of Black people in Bermuda fell noticeably. It's not hard to imagine that most of these people were sent off the island on purpose. The introduction of amelioration was tied to pressure created by abolitionism and the clear dissatisfaction of enslaved people, which was becoming more known in Britain. Laws to improve the conditions of enslaved people in islands such as Jamaica and St. Kitts were passed much earlier than here in Bermuda by enslavers who wanted to show that slavery could be maintained with improvement. Britain didn't begin pushing for amelioration until the early 1820s. And we see locally that the legislature begins considering it in 1824. The law gets passed in 1827, as we can see on this screen. At this same time, free people of color continue to agitate for further rights, as can be seen in a petition written in January of 1834. This is the next generation on from those who'd written petitions in the early 1800s. In some cases, we can identify sons of those men. because this list, like the previous one, was signed only by men. They wrote asking for amelioration of their conditions, so using this same language. This was only 6 months before the end of slavery, so it also seems to show a separate interest, show the separate interests of this group of free people on the eve of slavery from those who are about to become formally enslaved. So I will comment on this ad just because I think it's really fascinating. This ad was actually submitted, the one up in the top right corner, it's a little difficult to read, but I'll tell you a bit about it, was submitted by the Royal Gazette for a man named Kit who worked carrying newspapers. We learn from this ad where Kit delivered newspapers. We see the parishes of Devonshire, Smiths, and Hamilton. And we also find out where he used to be held in slavery. He was formerly enslaved in Somerset. There's an amount here that's been given, some ads have amounts, some don't, of $3 that will be given to anyone who will bring him back. One interesting ad I found was going to give different amounts if someone could prove that the reason the person had run away was to work for another white person, or if they were being harbored by a Black person. So that these ads kind of tease out different relationships in the community between how self-liberated enslaved people might have been hidden, or how they may have been working for other people, which can be seen more clearly in the other ad on this page, where 5 men who have a range of skills are listed, and those who are reading the ad are cautioned not to employ them without first contacting the people who have written the ad. And they're the executors and executrix of the will of the late F.F. Hinson. F.F. Hinson shows up quite a few times in some of the runaway ads that I found. So I found that tracing these relationships as well very interesting. I also want to quickly mention everyday forms of resistance. This is something that came through in Mary Prince's story, including how she stands up to enslavers and takes inside jobs, as I mentioned before. We also see it in an incident in Musson's book, where she is describing something that happened to her grandmother and her great-grandmother. Her grandmother lessens the burden of a punishment meted out to her mother. Her mother was strung up overnight by her hands, and she put stones under her mother's feet, removing them at sunrise before they could be discovered. We also learn from Musson's book of the resistance of a man who was called Boy, who would listen in on meetings and learn the happenings of the island. He also resisted being put in a lockup by his enslaver after listening in on a meeting, and put the enslaver in the lockup instead. This led to him being sold off the island. He resisted initially, but then realized the only way out appeared to be to go. This episode hints at wider practices of selling enslaved people off the island for infractions. This also happened at state level, with the last 3 enslaved men to be transported for crimes they had been convicted of committing, being sent off of the island only a few months before abolition. An emphasis was placed on the moral education of the masses just prior to emancipation. Fears of social and economic disruption meant that government wished to ensure that the formerly enslaved became useful citizens who accepted their place at the bottom of the island's social hierarchy. Bermudian writer and former clerk to the legislator James E. Smith argues that from the 1820s, and with the backing of the local government, the Anglican Church developed a system of religious education with the intention of creating, and I quote, a morally responsible, respectable Black citizenry. The knowledge that emancipation of the enslaved was a certainty fueled the church's fervor to ensure that Black people received a rudimentary level of education, along with religious lessons. The Anglican Church was not the only organization who was creating places of education, schools at this time. And a number of schools for Black children were opened in the early 1830s. So this brings us to the end of this first section. I'm looking at the time and I have 15 minutes left. So I was very ambitious with what I thought I could get through. But I think for me, that kind of underpins a lot of what comes in the next section. So I probably will skip over most of the slides or just allude to things that maybe we can pick up in discussion later on. So if we can go to the next slide. In this section, we are thinking about abolition, compensation, friendly societies, and the construction of a post-slavery society in Bermuda. This act's short title is the Abolition Act of 1834, but of course it wasn't just about abolition. If we look at the longer title, we see it was about promoting industry among the former enslaved, and it was also about giving compensation to those who had claimed ownership of them. 20 million pounds sterling, the largest payout at that time of the British government, was used to make these payments. Well, you can view this on an online database that I was able to work on, that is hosted by UCL for the Legacies of British Slave Ownership Project. You can key in names of Bermudians into that database and see what compensation they received. This information is also available, as Theo Francis showed in a recent presentation that he did for the National Library, in the Royal Gazette, which is digitized, has been digitized by the library. Abolition was going ahead under the proviso that the enslaver received monetary compensation and the formerly enslaved fit into a new society which operated under what Denise Noble has called colonial freedom. That is, the colony would continue to operate along the lines of a status quo as much as possible, with the hierarchies that existed before slavery ended being maintained. These include hierarchies of race, class, gender, and sexuality. The new social order was to mimic as closely as possible the values of Victorian Britain. Well, when Victorian Britain came, of Britain at that point. It's not Victorian yet, is it? I was thinking about Noble's work, which is a slightly later period. So we have these post-slavery laws. I picked these up because these are laws from 1834, but as correspondence from 1838 point out that these acts were specifically targeted at formerly enslaved people. They don't mention race. They use in the main, except for the first one. But they restrict the movement of people, things like the Vagrancy Act, and they are there to make sure that poor people don't move between parishes and become a supposed burden on that parish, and also thinking about the economy. So this slide is quite a bit, and I don't think I actually have time to go into detail, but I will say that like the period before the abolition of slavery, the government, church, and schools were used to continue to maintain the status quo. And in specifically government, there was an idea that although having a white majority government was not the best thing, Bermuda should be left to make up its own mind. And we actually have governors, Governor Chapman, who argue that it was convenient and safe to let the actual supremacy of whites continue, even though the abolition had ended all legal allowances for that system. What we also see in this period is ideas around benevolence that we have during enslavement being transferred into benevolence around ideas of emancipation. However, Soltis argues that the decisions by the Bermuda legislature to reject the apprenticeship scheme, which was carried out on most of the Caribbean islands, was to show themselves as a capable ruling class by presenting the enslaved as ready for immediate freedom. We find that in a lot of the islands that did still have the old representative system, they went to crown colony, became crown colonies in this transitional period. Soltis Maxwell explains that their strength was not a superior ability to rule, but their ability to use their political clout to deny social equality to the formerly enslaved. I'm sorry not to speak as much about the friendly societies, but if we look to the recording that Michael Bradshaw did for Mary Prince Day, I think he covers it in a really beautiful way, and he's done a lot of work on this. You also find information about the Friendly Society in Musson's book and in Heritage as well. So we've got the 1840s, and what I want to highlight here, because we've talked a bit about education already, we've talked a bit about governance. We see forms of alternative governance, the friendly societies continue, but also the Oddfellows come into being. And between the friendly societies and the Oddfellows, we find an important kind of alternative governance in Bermuda. After the emancipation and abolition of slavery, enslaved people were left destitute. Unlike the former enslavers, they were given nothing. They were sent out to try and make their own way. And we see this in the story Musson tells of her grandmother as well, where they leave on Emancipation Day and they don't know where they're going. They start out and then they stop, and something comes in the way. I can't remember what it is off the top of my head right now, but they then redirect to the home of a man who had already been free, who takes them in. And we see that there are some formerly enslaved people who end up going back to the home of their enslavers because they don't know where else to go. And this was something that the friendly societies was created to offer a safety net that the state wasn't offering. They also had ideas about industry. And I think Bradshaw explaining that they weren't like the petitioners before slavery. They weren't trying to change the social order of Bermuda. They were trying to find a place within it as colonial citizens. Immigration and race. I have a lot on this. I've done some work around the immigration policies to increase agriculture in the island. And the thing that I will take away from this is, like everything else that we've spoken about this evening, there is an idea that the elites have that they think will improve Bermuda. In this case, agricultural workers. So they wanted agricultural workers, but they also wanted to increase the white population. So through these different schemes, they tried to entice people from Malta initially, and also from England, but they were very specific. They wanted agricultural workers. They didn't want people from the north of England. That might have been slightly later than this time period. Governor Reed suggested that due to Bermuda's latitude, the white man was able to labor, which meant that Black people were not indispensable. And this, as I said, it echoes arguments made by the Bermuda legislator in the early 1800s. They couldn't get rid of the Black people that were already there, but through immigration, they were going to try and even out the population. If I can't really think of a better way to say it. These schemes were also petitioned. So in October of 1855, 536 Black men signed a petition asking the council support in opposing the Assembly's decision to give £1,000 to encourage farm laborers to migrate to Bermuda. So this is after Portuguese migrants had arrived in 1849 from Madeira. There were still other schemes that were happening to bring farmers and families from England, with the idea of having this as a scheme that would occur over 20 to 30 years. We know from what happens later in the centuries that these plans didn't come to fruition, but once again, they show the dream held by those in charge to increase the white population. Also in the 1850s, these schemes still had purchase and would go on to underpin further immigration schemes later in the century that brought Swedes, among others, to Bermuda. We can see where the island's population from this slide stood in 1851 comparatively with those reaching back to 1806. And I've highlighted a few. There are other censuses in this time. Some of them only enumerate certain groups of people. I've tried to pick the ones that had a cross-section of the island's communities. By now, there was no possibility of forcing Black people to leave, though some of them, of course, migrated by choice. To paraphrase Packwood, Black people were brought to Bermuda against their will, but as history records, we are here to stay. History making is used in the construction of self and nation. The inclusion and exclusion of stories in mainstream narratives says much about how we wish to see ourselves as a people. But the archives, our elders, and our traditions have other stories to tell us. The story often told of Bermuda's past was one of benign slavery with benevolent enslavers who then kindly liberated the enslaved in 1834. But as we've explored this evening, the act of claiming ownership of another human being is an act of violence in and of itself. It allowed for the restriction of people's mobility, allowed for them to be sold away from their families, dictated what they ate, wore, and how they spent their time. The myth of benevolence dripped into the post-emancipation era, as well as those in the colonies and metropole alike congratulating themselves for abolishing slavery. But as historian Catherine Hall has shown, former enslavers and their descendants used this moment to reconfigure race to meet the continued demands of colonialism. For although slavery ended, empire did not. In Bermuda, as elsewhere, Black people were treated as second-class citizens, and women, Black women, were regulated outside of the story, in part due to gender dynamics that saw attempts to remove them from public life. Nellie Musson and some of the other historians we've mentioned tonight mixed researching documents with oral history. Such work is key for learning more about Black people, as our appearance in the records is sparse and mostly not favorable. Musson notes that her grandmother told the story of her emancipation to her family every year, and that the story continued to be passed down. I wonder how many other families had similar traditions. What other collective memory of the immediate post-slavery era still remains in Bermuda, beyond those who had leadership roles in society? And how can we draw on our traditions, our gumbays, the food, music, dance, and art to talk back to the archives? Thank you.
Kristy, thank you so much. Again, I think there's a resounding applause, not just in my head, but in our shared audience, although we cannot see them. We are going to go into a question and answer period, and in the interest of time, and thank you everyone who's writing your responses now. Have a thought on some questions, and we will do our darndest to select a few. I do have a question in the interest of kind of getting things rolling. This is from Janet Ferguson. Who do you think had more power in the period under consideration? The local establishment or colonial authorities? I'll repeat that. Who do you think had more power in the period under consideration? The local establishment or colonial authorities?
That's an interesting question that I don't think I've thought much about. My first thought is, I guess it would depend on what you're talking about. So kind of in oversight and affairs, colonial authorities had oversight. They could pull things. They could deny passing acts, for instance. So the legislator could say, this is what we want to do, and it could get to London, they could say no. There are lots of schemes and many periods of Bermuda's histories that didn't pass colonial administrators. When I spoke with Eva Hudson, when I did some interviews a few years back, she saw the colonial officials as a mitigating force against the extremes of the local establishment, who wanted to do things in other periods like castrate people, and England said no. Of course, it was a symbiotic relationship. So it's not that there's a colonial kind of benevolent force in London. Part of their oversight was it wasn't in their interest for the local government to do these things, not just that they were being kind and thoughtful. Locally, however, things take time to go back and forth between Bermuda and London. So lots happen here between time that kind of miss oversight. So we know this from the long history of kind of privateers and pirating. We know this through actual customs. So Maxwell talks a lot about customs that were established here. So some of those come through law, but there are also ways of being that sit outside actual law as well.
Yeah, the tensions. I feel like, you've tried so hard to take on an area and time period that's so rich with so much happening in
Yeah.
terms of these structures that we're still attempting to dismantle, and the legacies of trauma that have been deep rooted into our psyche. That really, I feel like, and when you sort of surface through the Friendly Society, and the really important role they played, that we need to go back, and I think that this is part of what this lecture series is going to obviate, some of those topics that we really need to unpack a little further and farther.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, there's so much I missed. Like I'm seeing some things in here. I mean, it is a book. I mean, there is a book about, there are books about these time periods. And if you look in the books, there are whole chapters. So to be able to kind of cover that amount, I definitely didn't go into the church as much as the church was important in this era. But that's not my strong suit. I stuck with what I know of it a bit better. And there's so many other things as well.
Absolutely. And I just saw that someone's talking about being graciously moved. I mean, if truth be told, I was actually shedding a tear earlier. I don't know how many other people were, but I just think that there's our history is so complex, and we start to get quite emotional. There's a question though I don't know if I can, here, I'm just going to scroll back up through the chat. This is from Kathy Draycott. I'm not sure if you can see that. She's asking around this word choice of benevolence, and perhaps kind of, why was that word choice used to describe this space? I mean, I'm thinking about Turks and Caicos and some of the labor that was enforced on enslaved people that just makes my skin just crawl.
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know, but do you want to speak to that?
I think comparisons are really problematic. I gave a presentation once about enslaved children in St. Kitts, and someone else on the same panel had given a talk about street children in Paris, kind of historically, and someone wanted me to say which was worse. I don't do that, even if I have ideas, some ideas around things like that, but because everyone's lived experience is individual. So comparing yourself to the worst possible denominator and then calling yourself benevolent versus comparing yourself to what the actual standard of liberty and freedom is, that's where the problem for me comes in. And Bermuda was awful. We've done really well at suppressing the awfulness of it, because the everyday realities of Bermuda didn't call for certain things. So we didn't have large plantations. We didn't need people to be doing that kind of work. Actually, towards the end of slavery, part of these laws, part of this scheme to get rid of Black people in Bermuda towards the end of slavery was in part because they said there wasn't enough for people to do here anymore. And they're taking up jobs that we as and I'm quoting here, we as white people can do. So looking at the actual conditions of people's lives, we have an amazing example with Mary Prince. Where she tells her own story, and you can see, as I said, there are different relationships. She actually had affinity and strong feelings for her first enslavers, but she didn't understand her condition at that time. She was a child, and she was treated in broad sense as a day-to-day thing without physical violence. But as I tried to explain in the lecture, claiming ownership of a human being is violence in and of itself. So just doing that, there's something that I read in the newspaper, and also think Salters covered it, where there was someone who observed that people who were accused of a specific crime in Bermuda were still being put in having collars put around their neck. And you see some of these collars in images of slavery from across the Caribbean. They're heavy and awful implements. And someone wrote into the Gazette and started off by saying, oh yeah, that's really horrible. And it's really sad that happens, but it doesn't really happen that much. And what's awful actually is that this is being written in a paper that other people can read. And what they're thinking is that Bermudians are awful and violent, and that's not fair. So the other thing is their own reputation, how they wanted to be seen in the world, and how the idea of benevolent slavery fit in with their their identity, the way they wanted to be seen.
And dare we get into sort of how the history gets manipulated in order to satisfy tourism ventures into the early 20th century. That kind of is something that's just striking in my mind as I'm looking at a question from Arlene Brock. And she's kind of casting us a little bit more farther into asking about research related to churches. She's saying, 1790 to 1860 were the decades of consolidation of the Black community in Tuckerstown, including the addition to the BMA / later AME church to the existing Methodist church in 1920. Both churches were still in existence. Have you done much research on this community? And people are asking in the chat about your research. They're wanting to know about the church. They're wanting to know about Native American populations, African populations. They're wanting to know about specific people. And I think that, again, this is kind of where we may be able to gather some of these questions from the chat, and perhaps those become individuated responses, perhaps back. But did you want to speak just kind of broadly about any of these other facets of your research that you're looking into, perhaps as a teaser, I don't know, to another lecture or an upcoming publication?
The answer to most of those are no. So most of what I spoke about tonight, I mean, I've expanded on it, which is why I thank Carla into more detail, comes from my thesis, which has languished. So I'm really grateful for this opportunity to start thinking through some of these things again. But I really, the history of Bermuda that I looked at is kind of the socio-political development, how control is established. I don't really, in my own work, look at communities, not in that thesis, that is. A lot of the work I do now is about communities, but it's not in Bermuda, so there's a weird kind of disjuncture there. My thesis was about the independence debates. So I was interested in what the debates told us about us as people. So for me to do that, I needed to think about our past and how we got to a place, got to where we are, and how that past informs the positions that people have taken on independence. And critically for me, what race plays in that. And it's not kind of a simple kind of alignment, because of course people are for and against independence from many different backgrounds. But what I did find is that, like the past, there are people who prefer to maintain the status quo, even when the status quo actually is what is damaging them. That the idea of joining what is what pushes them. And I don't critique people in the past for that. And I try not to critique people in the present for that, because we have been disconnected so much from our histories, from the African past. Someone mentioned Native Americans, from these pasts that we have, that they've been denigrated, not just sidelined and silenced, but actually actively denigrated. So thinking about the past for me is about thinking about our present and our future. What do we want Bermuda to look like as we go forward? And it wasn't a thesis where I took a position on independence. I explored what kind of drove people to their positions. I explored that through thinking about formal education and informal education, about how being shaped in a colony impacts how we think about ourselves in the world. So that's a long way to say no. But
well, I'm looking at some of the statements.
I want that work to be done. I think I'm most comfortable now. I mean, originally I did some work in the 17th century, but I'm most comfortable now from about 1780 to the present day. That's my space.
And let's really hope that we may be inspiring further research, right? That whether you're a listener and a potential or a potential student of history to graduate level, I like what Linda Bogle-Meister's written here in terms of the importance of us all knowing our stories, listening to these stories. And this is the good work of Curb. We've got Lynn Winfield here. And I think in the interest of time, because we do try our best to kind of keep ourselves within this frame, is that we will say good night and thank you so much. Please know that everybody, if you've registered with us, that you will be receiving from us an email in coming days that has a link to this recording. We will ask you please to complete a short survey for us to give us some good feedback, and so that we can continue to improve what we do. And we will also be ensuring that you have the syllabus if you didn't receive it. Thank you to Dr. Deborah Atwood for her great work in putting that together. For the National Museum team, Katie Bennett's here and Janet Ferguson, thank you so much. And for all of our community. Stay safe, everybody.
Thanks for everyone putting messages in the chat to say thank you. I really appreciate you coming. Oh, hi, sister-in-law.
We did not get to, I'm sorry, the final question, excuse me, before I sign off. Thank you. How do we carry forward the legacy of activism? Well, I think a lot of the messaging is coming through to try to inspire us to do this. But if you do have any thoughts, I feel like we answered the question, first of all, by being present to historical research such as today. Let us see if there's any further statements. Can we do it again? Thanks, Francis. Well, there's going to be more coming, and Liz Daldwell, there's going to be more coming, and please stay tuned. I believe our next lecturer is going to be Dr. Theo Francis, as we will inch our way towards the contemporary moment.